Well, good morning. I'm Father John Markey. I'm the director here of the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Spirituality and the PhD director for the Spirituality program. And on behalf of Oblate, School of Theology, I'd like to welcome all of you to this third annual conference on spirituality and social justice, focusing today especially on Cesar Chavez, Faith Seeking Justice, I think was our final title. We go through a lot of titles. You know, it's really good to have you all here. We're going to get started on time. Even though we San Antonians know because of the rain, you know, it's so deterrent that people we think will be wandering in here as we go a little bit. But we're going to try to stay more or less on time and to the schedule. So it's good to have you all here. There's wonderful speakers and opportunities for your own sharing and input. Again, the focus, just to remind ourselves in many ways, is that for us here at OST in general, it's the mission of the institution and of the Oblates who founded us, that there is an intrinsic and direct relationship between the spiritual life and the life of active work for justice. And in, I think, many ways, there's very few in the kind of pantheon of great North American civil rights and religious leaders of the 20th century, like Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, Cesar Chavez. One of the things that holds this group of people together is not just that they fought for human dignity, for civil rights, for justice, for people, especially people on the margins, people that other people want to forget or deny their full rights. It's that they did so out of a basis of faith and out of a basis and out of a deep desire not just to achieve through struggle some victory, but to achieve reconciliation and the common good and the greater good for everyone, not just the group they were serving. And so I think that spiritual, that sense of working on behalf of justice, which is something that helps everyone, that advances the society, advances everyone's dignity, I think that's at the heart of what our conference is about and certainly what our day is about. We are really blessed. When we started this, the idea of having this, we were hoping to get our next speaker to come because we wanted a real personal touch to this, for one thing. Someone who not just knew Cesar Chavez in one sense, but worked alongside him his whole life. But the other thing is, Paul Chavez, Cesar Chavez's son, in many ways embodies something that's critical to this whole belief, this whole notion of spirituality and justice, which is, this is deeply rooted in faith, it's deeply rooted in prayer, it's deeply rooted in a life of hope, as one of our other speakers will talk about, and nurturing hopefulness. But it's also about organizing. It's about hard work. It's about being there day in and day out at the side of people and coordinating, organizing, working. And Paul Chavez, who is the president of the Cesar Chavez Foundation, has been doing that day in, day out, literally probably since you could walk. You've been, Paul Chavez was one of 7 brothers and sisters who grew up in the Central Valley of California with their father and mother, organizing a union that became eventually known as United Farmworkers of America. Paul and his brothers and sisters, I think, were literally handing out leaflets and doing the organizational work as children. They endured a very long and difficult family crisis in many ways during the Delano grape strike and boycott and the many struggles that followed, which were, really an incredible moment in the history of not just organizing, union organizing, but in civil rights and human rights in America, often overlooked, but where real lives were lost, where real suffering and violence took place, and their family was at the heart of that. He spent his entire life with the farm worker movement. He was a personal assistant to his father and a union organizer and negotiator. He managed the United Farm Workers direct marketing operation and was the union's lobbyist. Again, the work of justice is about organizing. Since 1991, Paul has led the Cesar Chavez Foundation. He's the spearhead of the impressive growth of the foundation, and it impacts the lives. It's actually trying to move the farm workers beyond, I think, I don't want to speak for it, but one of the things that's so powerful about it is it's keeping alive in some ways the vision of Cesar Chavez that it's about more than just getting a good pay raise. It's about the dignity and quality of life. It's about seeing the entirety of life as important and the respect for people. Under his leadership, it's done things like affordable housing. They have 42 communities, 5,000 units across the country, economic development projects, the Radio Campesina is a Spanish language radio network, 9 stations, 500,000 listeners a day. It really works at the heart of the immigrant community, especially with new immigrants and with people, refugees and people who it's their first access in the U.S. And it also has an English language section because they're sons and daughters of immigrants who that's their language. The Chavez Foundation Education Fund provides after-school, summer enrichment programs, affordable housing, active senior centers. It does academic tutoring for thousands of students, assists in school districts, testing, summer programs, and it's partnered with major corporations now to give scholarships and develop programs for dreamers across the U.S. and primarily in Arizona. Paul directs the National Chavez Center, which promotes and preserves the legacy of Cesar Chavez, especially the historic property, the 40 acres near Delano and La Paz, where his father and mother lived and worked. It's really an honor for me personally to have Paul here. As I say, the family and his mother, his brothers and sisters, in a way that's also part of what we remember today when we think about the spirituality of justice. That it's not a single act, it's not a single person who's does it, it's a community of people who give their lives in service to the poor through all kinds of ways. And so it's as much about Paul and his family in many ways as it is about his father. And so it's with all that in mind that we welcome him and thank him again for being with us. Paul Chavez.
Thank you very much for that long introduction. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning, and really I want to thank you all for developing this symposium. You know, we've it's 25 years now that my father's passed away, and during that time we've talked about a lot of different aspects of his life. We've talked about him as a labor leader and work that he's done with animal rights and different areas that you wouldn't necessarily relate to Cesar Chavez. But one thing that we have failed to do is to talk about his spirituality. And it was that faith that sustained him during those difficult times. And so when we heard about the symposium, I said, yes, I want to be part of that, because I believe that we need to talk more about that. Because, unfortunately, our friends from the right almost have a monopoly on spirituality and the work, right, that we have in front of us. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to share some remembrances I have of my father in his life and his work, and also how he used social justice how he uses spirituality to address the issue of social justice. My father, he really meant different things to different people. For many in the labor movement, he was in the 60s and 70s. He was a breath of fresh air that brought a vitality to a labor movement that maybe wasn't so vibrant as it had been in the past. During that time, Latinos from across the Southwest saw him as the leader of a growing Chicano movement. He was kind of the standard bearer, the personification of this move for empowerment. And then there were others, especially in the faith community, that saw my father's life and work as the gospels in action. And the fact of the matter is that all of those different views of my dad are legitimate. See, but I think what really distinguished my father from a lot of others was his abiding faith that he had in people. He had this tremendous faith in people, and it was his deep-held spirituality that really transformed trade unionism as we knew it and the struggle for social justice. It took courage and thinking outside the box for my dad to help farm workers openly embrace their cultural and their religious traditions by bringing them into the work of the union. Many other unions at that time just didn't do that. He led peregrinaciones, or pilgrimages, not just marches. And at the head of those peregrinaciones was the standard of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the patron saint of Mexico. Masses and all important functions of unions always began with the Mass. My father would remind people that he didn't do hunger strikes, that he was fasting, and he would remind them that a hunger strike is kind of like a political action where you're trying to get somebody to do something, whereas a fast is a deeply personal thing where you take a look at your own shortcomings and your own actions, and you look for ways to do better work in the future. And the thing is that those fasts are really, really deeply rooted in our Catholic tradition. And so, during his life and his work, Rebecca's here, and you'll remember that my father was criticized a lot when he was alive. And even now that he's passed away, he's been criticized. People would say that he should have focused more on traditional collective bargaining, wages and hours and conditions of work, that he wasn't a real union leader. And the thing is that if you judge him by, the traditional orthodoxy of trade unionism of its day, then there might be some validity to that. But the fact of the matter is that his vision was much broader than that. There was critics from both the right and the left. There were those Christians that said that it should only be practiced on Sundays and within the confines of a building, and not during the week, and for sure not in the fields of Central California and South Texas. There were others that came in and they said that there was no place for religion in our struggle, that, it was the opiate of the masses, and that it should be a secular struggle, and he rejected both of those views. And then there were other cynics that argued that, the use of the religious imagery and the symbolisms that we had in our movement that were adopted from the very beginning were really tools to help fend off the red baiting that had plagued most union organizing for generations. But again, the fact is that his motivation and the acceptance of our traditions were something much more profound. They were spiritual. In the 1980s, my father wrote the Prayer of the Farm Worker Struggle with the help of a Protestant minister, Reverend Chris Hartmeyer, who was the longtime executive director of the National Farm Worker Ministry. It was an organization of Protestant clergy and lay people that served farm workers. And that prayer has become the heart and soul of our work on the farm worker movement. Today, meetings held with the UFW, the United Farm Workers, with the Cesar Chavez Foundation, with La Unión de Pueblo Entero in the Valley in Texas, here in Texas, South Valley, began with people reciting the farm worker prayer. That prayer reminds us of those guiding principles that have distinguished our movement from others from the very beginning. It guides us in our daily work, and it really offers, I think, insights into the spirituality that my father had, and would also distinguish our movement from many others. And I think that that's one of the reasons why this movement has continued to service folks, even 3 decades after it was written and then after 25 years since my father's passing. You know, in preparing for this, I was thinking, well, you know, what am I going to talk about? And, you know, I got to admit, the first thing that came to my mind was that my dad had this famous little saying, and he would say it with this little smirk. He would say, we're gonna pray a little and we're gonna work a lot. And that's really how he approached his work. You know, so what I would like to do is I'd like to examine the prayer of the farmworker struggle stanza by stanza, and I'd like to offer some insights on how I think that spirituality played into my father's daily work. And so, so it begins, show me the suffering of the most miserable, so I will know my people's plight. Like my aunts and uncles and many others of his generation, my dad left the fields. The idea was that you worked to get out of the fields. And so he left the fields and he began working full-time in 1952 with the Community Service Organization. And he helped build his Community Service Organization into the largest and most militant and effective Latino civil rights group in California in the 50s and 60s. You know, but after about 10 years, he began to take stock of himself. By then, he was the staff director for the CSO. It was his first steady job, and it was the first time since being a farm worker that our family didn't have to worry about paying the rent or where money was going to come to put food on the table. We really did live a middle-class life in East Los Angeles. My dad had a week's paid vacation. He wore suits to work. He even had a Brooks Brothers credit card, right? And he drove a Volvo. How many Chicanos were driving Volvos in the 50s? Yet on his birthday, on March 31st, your birthday as well, it was his 35th birthday, he quit his job with the CSO and he gave up the only steady paycheck that he ever had. And mind you that him and my mom had 8 children from 3 to 13 years in age. But together they made that faithful decision to give up that comfortable life. And they knew, when they made that decision, they knew what awaited them. They were going back to the fields that they'd hoped to escape. And so they piled all of us into that little 2-door sedan, and they drove us over the grapevine into the Central Valley of Delano, and we lived in a little 2-bedroom house, all 10 of us. My mom went back to working in the fields along with my older brothers and sisters. On the weekends, my dad would join them. And it was that life that they thought that they'd gotten away from. My dad, while driving up and down the Central Valley of California, would babysit the younger kids, and he would take them with him as he talked to workers. And you know, it was during that decade that he was out of the fields. He could never forget the plight of the farm workers. It was a life that he had lived. He endured those humiliations and that suffering. And so when he went to the CSO, he had hoped that the CSO would be able to help farm workers. But after 10 years, he came to realize that he couldn't help farm workers from afar. He knew that the only way to help farm workers was to go back to a life that he had escaped. And that meant giving up the most comfortable life that him and my mother had ever lived. And I think that decision to give up that comfort was really taken from the inspiration that he got from St. Francis of Assisi, that also took a vow of poverty and he gave up a middle-class life to be of service to the poor. My dad and Dolores and the others that helped found the union understood that the plight of farm workers really extended beyond the fields, that after a long, hard day's work in the fields, people came home to a whole different set of problems. There was the lack of affordable housing for families, access to educational opportunities for our children, health care, and a whole sinfín de problemas, just a litany of problems. And so that they knew that the only way to remedy the poverty and the discrimination and the despair that farm workers face was to build a movement. It would take more than a union. And so years before the first big organizing campaigns or even the Delano grape strike, they began by offering services to people to address their dilemmas. There was a death benefit that was offered to members to help bury their loved ones with dignity. There was a credit union, the first one in the history of the United States, set up for farm workers, that was established to help people during those tough winter months when there was no unemployment insurance, that would help them get by into the next harvest season. They had things like a cooperative gas station where people could come in and get discounted gas, but more importantly, that they would have a service bay with a mechanic that was part of the movement that would help people fix their cars so that they would be able to provide for their families. And then there was the service centers, where people could come and they could get help with the whole myriad of problems that they faced on a daily basis. And so the work continued. The next stanza is, free me to pray for others, for you are present in every person. You know, central to my father's spirituality was his belief in nonviolence. And the thing is, his belief in nonviolence was much more than a convincing strategy. It really was a moral imperative. He saw all life as precious. He believed that all life was a gift from God. He believed that God was present in every person. And so he believed that no one, farm worker or grower alike, had the right to injure or take life for whatever cause, for however just the cause. You know, in a letter that he sent to a big growers association in 1969, he wrote, if to build our union required the deliberate taking of a life, either the life of a grower or his child, or the life of a farm worker and his child, then I'd choose not to see the union built. His vision was built, and it was grounded in love and respect for all people. Now, he was also a pretty good tactician, though. He understood that nonviolence was more powerful than violence. And he would say that when you practice nonviolence, that you're in control of the struggle, as opposed to responding to the moves from your opposition. But he knew that farm workers needed to commit themselves to nonviolence, and that it would take patience and perseverance and determination, but that if you did that, that change would happen. He was also pretty old school. He didn't believe in taking shortcuts. He believed that the way you make change is by going to work every day, and he saw violence as a shortcut that people who are frustrated and angry take when they lose hope. He also understood that workers just weren't struggling for better wages and conditions. He knew that at the heart of the struggle was this demand for respect. And so while he understood that using violence might coerce growers into concessions, he knew that it would never, ever garner their respect. And he believed that once you're respected, then you'll be treated as a human being. And when you're viewed as a human being, then you'll be paid decent wages and you'll work in conditions that are safe. And all of those other things that respect demand will be afforded to you. And so they went on strike, and after about two and a half years in the early 60s, this was the beginning of the movement, the grape strike. After about 2.5 long years on strike, people became a little bit frustrated. They were beginning to lose hope. And there was talk about violence. People were angry for the abuse they had suffered on the picket lines and the humiliation at the hand of growers and their goons. And so, you know, people were looking to strike back. And my father, looking at the situation, felt that he had failed as a leader to properly teach and to help people understand the strength and the wisdom of nonviolence. And that it would take hard work and determination and perseverance, and there were no shortcuts. And so in 1968, is actually 50 years ago this March, he undertook his first public fast. During those 25 days that he fasted, he lost 35 pounds. By the end of the fast, the doctors were concerned that he would injure himself and that his life was in peril. And I think that during that time, many discussions were held, and really the issue that came up was that, you know, as people saw him suffering, they began to ask themselves, if this man's prepared to sacrifice his life, what are we prepared to do? What am I prepared to do? And eventually the talk of violence stopped. Those that didn't accept it left. They were asked to leave. and those that remained behind committed themselves to nonviolence. And so the strike continued for another 2.5 long, difficult years until the grape boycott. And that was a boycott that was held across North America, brought the growers to the bargaining table, and they signed their first collective bargaining agreements providing benefits and protections for tens of thousands of farm workers. But it also established the United Farm Workers as the first enduring union for farm workers in the history of this country. The prayer goes on, help me take responsibility for my own life so that I can be free at last. You know, my dad was convinced that real change would never happen for farm workers unless they took personal responsibility for the union, that they made the union their own. And again, he realized that it demanded a lot of sacrifice and determination to accomplish. As I mentioned earlier, my mom was working in the fields again, like she had done growing up. But she was working in the fields this time to feed her family of 8 and to give my dad gas so that he had money to drive up and down the Central Valley in his organizing campaigns. On the weekends, I remember that they would take us all out to the fields and we'd go pick peas, or we'd gather walnuts, or whatever was in season, to earn a couple extra dollars just to try to get by until the next week. At the union's founding convention in 1962, about 280 people showed up. And they gathered and they passed resolutions that called for the establishment of key programs and services for people. You know, people were excited. There was hope that something would happen. They believed that the union could change their lives. It was at that time that the union's Black Eagle was unveiled, to the astonishment of many people. Some people were scared of it. You know, there was chants of Viva la Causa, Viva la Unión. And of the 280 people that gathered, 212 paid their first month dues of $3.50 that they'd agreed to pay. 90 days later, only 12 people were paying their $3.50 a month dues. People, you know, were saying, well, they're poor, they can't afford it. My dad's reply was, if we all don't take responsibility, this union will never survive. This union will never be ours. You know, I recall my dad talking about one particularly difficult situation where he had to go and collect dues. You know, during the winter months in the Central Valley, it's cold and it's foggy and there's no work, and there was no unemployment insurance, and so people really scrapped to get by. There was a farm worker in McFarland, which is a little town about 5 miles south of Delano, that was behind on his dues. And so my dad went to collect. And like many others, that member was having a hard time getting by those winter months. And so my dad goes to his house, and as he's getting there, the member is leaving. He's going to the store to buy groceries for his family. They have a discussion about the dues and how tough it is, about the hope that the union offered to everybody. And so then after talking, they both went into the store, and the member got change for his $5 bill that all he had. And he gave my dad $3.50. And he spent $1.50 for food for his family. And he went home. And it was a difficult situation for everybody. A difficult situation for the man who has to provide for his family. Difficult situation for my father to go out and ask for that money to come out of the food for those kids. But they both knew that every attempt to organize a union for farm workers had been defeated, had been crushed. People had been beaten and killed. They'd been demoralized. Hope had been taken away from folks, and they'd faced every obstacle. And every time they organized, businesses, agribusiness would join forces with the local judges and the police and the powers that would be to stop the organizing and to beat back the union attempt, the unionization attempt. But my father believed that the faith shown by that man gave him belief that this union could succeed and that they could build a union for farm workers. The next 2 lines read, grant me courage to serve others For in service there's true life. You know, my dad used to talk about the difference between people who are of service and those who are servants. He said that there's countless, good men and women who commit daily acts of kindness and charity. But he also would go on to point that there's relatively few folks that become true servants by fully dedicating themselves to the most neediest among us. At the end of his 25-day fast for nonviolence in 1968, my father knew that hearts had been opened, and so he used the occasion to talk to people and to call them to service. He said, in part, when we're really honest with ourselves, we must admit that our lives are all that really belong to us. And so it's how we use our lives that determine what kind of men we are. It is my deepest belief that only by giving our lives do we find life. I'm convinced that the truest act of courage, the strongest act of manliness, is to sacrifice ourselves for others in a totally nonviolent struggle for justice. To be a man is to suffer for others. God help us to be men. It's a half a century later, 50 years after those words were first spoken. Today, both of my parents lay buried side by side in this beautiful national monument that has been established by President Obama. This memorial garden there. It was the 398th unit of the national park system that President Obama came and dedicated in 2012. And in that monument, there's only one message that we decided that should be the focus of people when they come to visit and pay their respects. And it comes from that call to service and that statement at the end of the 1968 fast. And on both English and Spanish, we have the words, "It is my deepest belief that only by giving our lives do we find life." A true call to service. The next stanza reads, "Give me honesty and patience so that I can work with other workers." I remember shortly after my dad passed away, we began to attend different commemorations, and people would ask me, "Well, how would you characterize your father in a few words?" And I'm thinking, well, first of all, I wouldn't, but if I had to, I'd probably come up with something like, he was the most patient man I ever met, right? And I say that because he worked every day like it was his last. He'd be up early in the morning. Many times when he was home on a hill above the house, where he would meditate and practice yoga as the sun came up. And then he'd be into the office before many folks would get to work. He'd put in a long day's work, and then he would drive to meet with workers in the evening, often getting home after midnight, and then he would repeat it again the next day. He didn't take vacations, but at the same time, he was patient. He was patient because he knew that the struggle for social justice demands persistence and dedication, and that you need to stick to it in order for real change to happen. And he really believed that over time, that hard work and dedication would win. He used to say all the time, the rich have money, but the poor, we have time. It was a lesson that hit home for me when I was a union's lobbyist in the early 80s. It was a time that a favorable Democratic administration was leaving, and there was a newly elected Republican governor coming in. And it was about a month to go before he would take over the administration of the state of California. During the campaign, the growers had given over $1 million to his campaign, and so we knew what was going to happen once he took power. We knew that one of the first acts that would be taken would be to shut down the enforcement of the historic farm labor law that was passed in 1975 with the help of Governor Jerry Brown. It was the first and the only law that gives farm workers the right to bargain collectively in the United States. And so before the governor took office, we launched a campaign to have the governor fill the enforcement position that would last at least 4 years into the new administration. But we needed him to make a nomination, and then we needed to have the state Senate confirm it. And so the governor made a nomination of a person that we thought would be faithful to the law And so we set out and we had this statewide campaign to get the nominations approval by the state Senate. We had farm workers and supporters, hundreds of them up and down the state of California, visiting senators' offices, sitting in their offices, going to their homes, looking for every advantage to get them to support the nomination and to vote for the confirmation. And finally, the day for the confirmation came, and it was on the last day of the legislative session. Actually, it was one of the last actions of that legislative session. And so after a long, hard, difficult campaign, my dad, along with a couple hundred farm workers, watched the final vote count. We were at the gallery, overlooking the ornate Senate chamber. We needed 21 votes. And the roll call was called, and people cast their votes, and we came up with 20 votes. 1 vote short. I was devastated. I felt like things were over, that we had lost. I knew that the enforcement of this law protecting farm workers would be decimated. And I knew the terrible consequences that would come to pass, and they did come to pass. And so I was convinced that we'd lost and it was over. And so it was around 11 o'clock by the time my dad finished speaking to the last of the workers and offering words of encouragement. And he tells me, Mijo, why don't we drive home tonight? Now, remind you, Sacramento to La Paz, where we live, is about 5 hours. But I said, okay, because I wasn't going to sleep. I felt terrible. And so we started driving home on Interstate 5, and it's quiet drive, and he didn't say much. He could tell how badly I felt. And after about an hour, we passed through Stockton, California, and it was then that he began to talk. And he says, how you feeling? I told him, I let you down, Dad. I let farm workers down. I let the movement down. I felt terrible. I still feel bad about that. And he asked me, well, did you do everything you could do? I said, Dad, I did everything I knew to do. Did you leave any stones unturned? I said, Dad, I can't think of anything else I should have done. And then he says, well, did you work as hard as you could work? I said, Dad, I've never worked this hard in my life. And then he said some words to me that seemed like he just spoke him yesterday. He said, remember, mijo, our work isn't like a baseball game, where after 9 innings, whoever has the most runs wins and the other loses. It's not a political campaign where politicians campaign, and on election day, whoever has the most votes wins and the other loses. He says, in la causa, our work, you only lose when you give up. You only lose when you quit. And then he says, let's go home and get some rest because we got a lot of work to do tomorrow. See, what people don't know or don't remember is that in the 31 years that my dad led the movement, he suffered more defeats than victories. He had to build the union 3 times. 3 different occasions to build the union. Yet, after each defeat, after each setback, he would get himself up and dust himself off, and he would go back to the fight. And so the message was very clear, that victory is ours if we persist, that victory is ours when we resist, and victory is ours when we refuse to give up. The prayer goes on. Bring forth song and celebration so that the Spirit will be alive among us. You know, during the 50s, when my dad began to organize new chapters of the CSO up and down the state of California, he began attending different Protestant services. The services at the African American churches really inspired him. He was moved by the rousing singing and the clapping and just the overall enthusiasm. And the thing is that it sharply contrasted his own religious upbringing, especially before the Vatican II, right? He was impressed with the anthems that came out of the civil rights movement, songs like We Shall Overcome. He was uplifted by the music of the Cursillo movement of the Catholic Church. And so, as we began to do the work of the union, he brought that revival-like clapping and singing into the farm worker movement. We sang De Colores. It became the anthem of the farm worker movement. Nosotros venceremos. We shall overcome was sung at all of our meetings. No nos moverán, an old labor movement. We shall not be moved. was also a song was also sung on a regular basis. And then you had groups like Luis Valdez and Teatro Campesino that performed actos during the strikes, and many times in the fields and the roads they would use the back of a truck to be the stage, and they would use comedy and satire to ridicule growers and to help people laugh at their biggest fears and overcome them. The movement gave rise to a revolution in Latino arts, and it went from the teatros to those elaborate murals that we used to have on the back of our conventions that spoke to the hopes and aspirations of our community. And there were silkscreen artists up and down the state, people like the Royal Chicano Air Force in Sacramento, an artist collective that did posters that informed people, but also inspired them through their art. And so it was used in all manners of art forms and media. My dad, apart from working hard, also enjoyed celebrating life. And so he would regularly bring people together, especially those folks that couldn't go home during the holidays. And they would have community celebrations for Easter and Thanksgiving and Christmas. And we had Passover Seders. And people would ask him, well, why are we celebrating, right, Passover? And he would say, well, remember, Christ wasn't a Christian. And he would quiet people. During the late 70s, La Paz, our headquarters, experienced its own baby boom. There was marriages almost every other weekend, it seemed like. And, my dad was the ultimate matchmaker. If somebody was going together, a couple was going together, he would when are you going to get married? Right? And I think it was his excuse to throw a good party and to celebrate life. And so, he would actually go out, and after he convinced them or urged them to get married, he would actually go find a minister or a priest to marry folks. And then he made sure that there was food and there was music for the celebrations. And then he would also invite half of the union membership. My mother would get so angry that she'd scold him and she'd tell him, Cesar, this isn't your wedding, remember that. So the prayer continues, let the spirit flourish and grow so we will never tire of the struggle. Almost as important as the union work for my father was the work of building a community, that he and thousands of dedicated people who joined him over the years to work for social justice could live their lives that were based in the principles of nonviolence and self-sacrifice and service to others. And the thing is that was a hard thing to accomplish in the hustle and bustle in Delano, in the Central Valley where the union began in 1962. So by the late 60s, my dad began to look for a place that he could build a community of like-minded men and women, a place that farm workers could come to be trained to run their union, I should say, and a place that could serve as a refuge for him and other folks that were constantly engaged in the fight for social justice. In 1971, he moved the headquarters from Delano to a new place that he christened Nuestra Señora Reina de la Paz. La Paz, as it's known today, was set in an old county tuberculosis hospital. It's 187 acres of oaks and some really beautiful rock outcroppings in King, California, which is about 30 minutes outside of Bakersfield in the foothills of the southern Sierra Nevada mountain range. My dad's life was filled with conflict and turmoil. His life was full of it. If he wasn't organizing strikes and organizing campaigns in the rural parts of the states, and he was involved in political campaigns and boycotts in urban centers. And so coming home to La Paz served as a personal refuge for him. It was a place that he could come back and he could recharge his spiritual batteries, that he could plan and prepare for the next campaign. My father was devoutly Catholic, and whenever we were on the road, first thing we would do is, where's the local church? Because he would want to go and celebrate Mass every morning. But he was also a student of Eastern religion. He studied Zen Buddhism. He read Thomas Merton. As I mentioned earlier, he was up early in the morning. He was practicing yoga and meditating before the sun came up. In La Paz, there was about 250 people that lived there, men, women, and children. And most were volunteers. And so they lived on very little. In the beginning, it was $5 a week, and then it was $10 a week plus room and board. So it was a difficult life. But my father loved living in community with people, and he loved bringing people together to learn about the latest happenings in the movement. And many times we had interesting people visiting us, and he would gather everybody together, and there would be community meetings where we would learn and we would listen to other folks. And so I remember growing up meeting people like Dom Helder Câmara, the Archbishop from Brazil, who many people think is a saint, me included. You know, but then also there was other folks. There was actors like Anthony Quinn that came in and talked about when he was a farm worker in Oxnard, or Cornelio Reina, a norteño superstar, right, that wanted to play my dad in one of his B-rated movies that he wanted to produce, right? Also at La Paz, there was this big organic garden that my father had. He experimented. He wanted to experiment growing fruits and vegetables without the use of dangerous pesticides and herbicides. And so by the late 70s, he began to ask the staff to leave their work. We worked 6 days a week back then. Asked them to leave their work on Saturday and to go work in the garden. You know, I think my dad was always a little bit uncomfortable with the hierarchy in the union. But he understood that you needed a chain of command to get work done and to organize the work properly. Yet, I think that he felt that when people worked in the garden, that everybody was the same. There was no more status. You had attorneys working next to farm workers, next to volunteers. And what came from that garden, the food that came from that garden was prepared in a large community facility, a dining room, a kitchen and a dining room that my father aptly named Pan y Vino, which means, you know, bread and wine, but in the Catholic tradition has a much deeper meaning. My dad had this advocation, and he was interested, and he always studied, and he wanted to maintain relationships with societies and institutions that organized people around something more than money. And those included Catholic orders. And so when he was on the road, he didn't stay in hotels. He stayed in you know, in the bedrooms of the local parish priest that was working for social justice. We stayed in convents and different places. He established relationships with some of the groups, the anti-Baptist movement, the Bruderhof, that were working for social justice, and they lived and worked in community. There were the groups like the Catholic Worker that we enjoyed a long working relationship with, and there was even groups like the Hare Krishna that interested him. It was those groups that lived and worked together. And he understood the community, the strength of community. He understood that when people work and eat together, that it can be a very powerful thing. And at La Paz, it was a place that he could join other people, and that they could draw strength from each other, and that they could more fully live a life of common purpose. The next stanza is, "Let us remember those who have died for justice, for they have given us life." You know, I'd mentioned earlier that it's been 25 years since my father passed away, and during that time, he's been honored in countless communities across the nation. There's annual celebrations. You have a big march here in San Antonio, and there's 11 states now that commemorate his birthday as a state holiday. Just this year, Washington State observed it. Last week, I was invited to Yonkers, New York, to attend the dedication of the Cesar Chavez Elementary School in Yonkers, New York. And you know, you go there and people talk about how my father was a hero to them and a role model, and you know, and the fact of the matter is that he never saw himself like that. As a matter of fact, he was pretty uncomfortable being singled out for praise and offered this recognition. He rarely allowed anybody to name anything after him. And I think that he felt this way because he knew that there were many people, men and women, children, who had made remarkable sacrifices and accomplished really extraordinary things, but whose names are largely lost to history. You know, my dad made sure that our movement faithfully remember the names and the lives of our 5 martyrs. You know, people think of the farm worker movement, Mexicanos, right? We're all Christians. Well, the fact is that the first martyr was a Jew. The second martyr was a Muslim. And then the subsequent 3 martyrs were Christians. There was Nan Freeman. She was an 18-year-old Jewish student, a woman from Massachusetts that was going to school in Florida that was killed on a picket line in 1972. A year later, Naji Daifala, an immigrant from Yemen, a strike leader, was killed by a Kern County sheriff outside of Lamont. 2 days later, Juan de la Cruz, a 65-year-old farm worker, was shot and killed on a picket line just a couple of miles from where Naji was killed. In 1979, in the Imperial Valley, Rufino Contreras, a young striker, was also shot during a lettuce strike. And then Rene Lopez, 21 years old, a leader of a strike at a dairy farm in Fresno, was shot and killed after casting a vote in a state-run election in 1983. In eulogizing Rufino Contreras, the striker killed in 1979, my father talked about our legacy. And he said that true wealth is not measured by power, prestige, or money. He says that it's measured by the legacy we leave behind for those we love and those we inspire. And so we have a tradition in the movement of remembering those people that made those kind of sacrifices, and we name important things after them. And many times they're the unknown heroes of our movement. You know, there's the first medical plan and pension plan in the history of the United States for farm workers, one named after Bobby Kennedy, a hero of ours, and the other named after Rufino Contreras, one of the martyrs. He started a tradition that we continue today with our affordable housing projects. We name them after people that have made important contributions. In our newest housing project up in Austin, Texas, we're going to be dedicating it to Emma Tenayuca, a young woman from San Antonio that was a leader in the pecan strike in the 30s. In communities throughout California and Arizona, we name them after folks that have meant a lot to us. There's Villa Salandini, named after Father Victor Salandini, the tortilla priest. And in South Texas, we have Casa Messina, that's named after Sister Carol Ann Messina, that went down to the valley and was a servant, was a servant to poor people. The prayer concludes, help us love even those who hate us so we can change the world. You know, during my father's last public fast in 1988, it was as long as it was for 36 days. He fasted because of the reckless use of pesticides and its effects on farm workers and their families. And so he fasted because he felt that he had not done enough to raise that issue. And so as he fasted, people began to look at themselves and say, what more can I do? And one of those people was a young girl, my niece, my dad's granddaughter, Julie Chavez Rodriguez. And so she volunteered to travel about an hour north to Fresno, California to hand out leaflets in front of a supermarket. The leaflets talked about the dangers that pesticides pose to farm workers and consumers. And so she was there handing out leaflets, and she handed out a leaflet to a middle-aged white woman. And she took it from Julie and she looked at it. And then she looks up at Julie and she says, I hope he dies this time. Julie was angry. She wanted to punch her. She wanted to pull her hair. She wanted her to feel the pain that she had just inflicted on her. And so it bothered Julie, but she wasn't going to bother my dad with it. She wasn't going to burden him with it because he was fasting. And so my dad saw her, and he could tell something was up. And so he began to talk to her, and he says, Mija, how did the trip go? And Julie reluctantly tells him what happens. And so my dad is there, and he says, Mija, the next time this happens, tell the person, I'm sure you're in his prayers as well. It's a powerful lesson for a young girl about nonviolence, about humility, about grace. And it's a meaning that has, and it's a lesson that has meaning for all of us. You know, it's been 25 years since my father's passing, and I more clearly now see and understand this prayer that he wrote. It becomes more relevant. It becomes more meaningful for me every year. And so I hope these stanzas and these stories that I've shared with you this morning help you understand and see the spirituality that my father brought to his work. You know, I think it's a powerful insight for those of us who continue to fight for social justice, especially during these difficult times. And so I'd like to end by asking all of you to stand and join with me as we recite the farmworker prayer. Please repeat after me. Show me the suffering of the most miserable, so I will know my people's plight. Free me to pray for others, for you are present in every person. Help me take responsibility for my own life, so that I can be free at last. Grant me courage to serve others, for in service there is true life. Give me honesty and patience, so that I can work with other workers. Bring forth song and celebration, so that the Spirit will be alive among us. Let the Spirit flourish and grow, so that we will never tire of the struggle. Help us love even those who hate us, so we can change the world. Amen. Thank you very much.